All right. Well, I'm really excited to introduce Barbara Swanson to the group tonight, although she needs no introduction. She's somebody whose photography I've admired from afar. She's one of our members and also a board member of the Buena Vista Audubon Society, where I am getting to know her better. She is also the past president of the North County Photographic Society, and I'm really excited to see her presentation tonight on bird photography.
All right,
Take it
thank
away.
you. I feel honored to speak to this great group of people here. And let me just share this okay, can everyone see that? Yes, okay. So I'll be talking about photographing birds, and all the photos are from San Diego County. So kind of what we can see around here. And just very briefly, I don't think I really need to talk too much about this, but why do I photograph birds? I've always loved birds, and birds are everywhere. So wherever you go, as you know, you can always find birds. So much variety in them with the color, shape, size, behavior. So there's always something new to be seen. It's a great excuse to be outside. And it's also challenging and exciting. So it never gets dull. So for this talk, it's kind of loosely divided into a few sections. One is kind of the technical equipment section, just talking about a few things there. Then talking more about what you do when you're out in the field and you're trying to photograph a bird. And then I'll also talk a little bit about a couple favorite places I like to go for bird photography. So for equipment, I think the most important thing is your lens. It really needs to be sharp, because if you don't have a good lens, no matter what your camera is, you're going to struggle. So for doing a lot of photography with smaller birds, I think it really helps to be in the 500 to 600 millimeter range. I used to have a 80 to 400, and that just wasn't enough reach. The zoom lenses are quite inexpensive now compared to prime lenses. They're also a lot lighter to carry. All the major manufacturers have them. So if you're in the market for one, do your research, really look online. There's tons of information, and really make sure you're getting a good lens. For the cameras, for the DSLRs, or now everyone's going mirrorless, I think really almost any of them will work. There are some pluses and minuses, but the cameras are so good these days that I think anything's going to give you good results. And for extra support, I sometimes use a monopod, more if I know I'm going to be walking a ways and then kind of standing in one place for a while, or I'm going to be photographing something that's going to be fairly dark, so I want that extra stability. I rarely use a tripod because I just don't want to carry it unless I'm going to be fairly close to my vehicle. But tripods can be great, but I just don't like carrying them. So when you're thinking about taking your photo, I think what your shutter speed is, of all the different options that you have shutter speed, f-stop, and your ISO. I think getting the right shutter speed is the most critical of those three parameters. I noticed that my percentage of sharp photos went up when I started increasing my shutter speed to have at least 1/2000, and preferably a little bit higher, like maybe even 1/2500 with my 200 to 500 millimeter lens. And what helped me get there to those fast shutter speeds is this software. I think it's under $100, and sometimes they have sales. Topaz Denoise. I highly recommend it. It's easy to use, and it's so good at noise reduction that I can now use much higher ISOs, which means I can increase my ISO and increase my shutter speed. Before I couldn't my photos were so noisy, I couldn't get rid of that noise. So I think that's very important. You can use slower shutter speeds if, say, the bird's stationary, but sometimes the bird's going to do something and then you're not going to have time to change. So I usually just go with the higher ISO and the faster shutter speed for the birds. And for birds that are really moving or flying, 1/2500 to 1/4000 is where I try to be. But often you can be less. You really need to experiment. It is a bit equipment dependent, whether you have a full frame sensor or a crop sensor, how far away the bird is, how fast it's moving, is it moving towards you? All those parameters come into play. So I should say that what I'm talking about is basically today for what works for me. And you may have a totally different way of doing things and it works great. And that's good because everyone's different, equipment's different. But if there's some areas that you're struggling with a little bit, this is kind of food for thought that maybe give you a few more things to think about. So getting the right exposure in your camera is, I think, critical. You want to be as close as possible. And for me, for many years, I've always used my histogram. And I've noticed that some people aren't so sure about their histogram. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about that for a couple minutes. And I thought for an example, I'd use a bird that has a lot of white, because that can be tricky. It can kind of fool your sensor. So what I try to do is I check my histogram to be sure that the brightest areas and the darkest areas are within my histogram. And if that's not good, I'll change my settings. And I try to do that before the bird does something interesting, so that I'm all set up when the bird actually does something that I really want to photograph. So for the histogram here, you can see this on your camera, and this I just took from Photoshop because it was a little easier. This axis here, these are your black pixels that are in your photo. And as you go to the right, these represents pixels that are lighter and lighter in tone. So these would be your mid-tone, and these would be your white pixels. So for down here, these pixels here, this area here is representing this part of the white pelican. But you can see that I still have a little bit here, so everything's in range. So I can still get really good feather detail here in the pelican. This whole mid-tone area is really representing the background and probably some areas of the bird. And then down here, these would be the very dark wing tips here of the bird. So that's how you can kind of look at the histogram. And then what I did is I gave examples of what an underexposed and an overexposed would look like. So if you're out in the field and you have this bird, and this is what your histogram looks like, everything's on there, you're probably pretty good. However, if your histogram starts to look like this for this particular bird, this shows that they call it a clipping warning, meaning that some of your white pixels, your white is overexposed and you've lost all detail, and you may never be able to get that detail back. So the area that had been here is now here, and actually some of it's lost. So you can see here how you can't really see much detail, especially in the wing. Well, that's represented here in your histogram. The background here is now brighter, shown up here that it's moved up to the right, meaning it's lighter than what it was here. And you really don't have any blacks anymore. Your darkest pixels here are now here, and you can see actually you don't have much that's actually truly black here. And if you're underexposing, so if your exposure isn't getting enough light into the camera, now everything's down at this end. So now some of your black pixels, your black colors are now clipped. So you're not going to get any detail here in the wings. The background's dark, and the white, instead of being up here, is now in this area. So if I had to choose between this underexposed and overexposed, I would take the underexposed one because you still have good feather detail here. And that's what you're really looking for is, do you have good feather detail? You're not as worried about the background. This, most people could recover. Even with a JPEG, you might be able to recover this enough. Whereas this with a JPEG, you'll never get a good photo out of that. So if you don't use your histogram and you have some exposure issues, I would recommend starting to learn about your histogram, because you can look at it in the field and adjust it. So it's not when you get home, it's like, oh no, what do I do now? You can't go back, perhaps. You want to try to get it right when you're taking the picture. And the other big thing is focusing. You really want a sharp eye. So I judge it by detail here in the orbital ring. Most birds have some sort of detail there or little feathers in this area. And that's how I really judge whether my photo is sharp. I use a continuous focus mode. So if the bird moves, your camera is automatically keeping up with the focus. And most of the cameras are pretty good nowadays about continuously focusing. I love single point focus, and I even read a lot of the major bird photographers. They also have single point focus as one of the things that they use. Other methods work great. Really depends on your camera. I just got a mirrorless, so I've got iFocus now, and I'm really trying to experiment where that works and where it doesn't work. So the best thing to do for focusing is find some YouTube videos of really good photographers who are doing wildlife with your camera model and see what they have to say, and, you know, use it as a suggestion, but it's always a good place to start. And especially if you're doing single point focus, the focus point in the very center of your camera and the sensor has the best and fastest focusing. So if you know you're going to crop like you're doing a warbler, I just set my single point focus, and actually the other focus ones too, in the center, so that I have the very best chance of getting good focusing. Try to anticipate where you think the eye is going to be. If the bird takes, say this Canada goose, that's your whole frame. Obviously, focusing in the center is not going to work. So try to anticipate what composition you want and where you think the eye is going to be, so you can get your focusing set in that area to help your camera focus. And really experiment and practice. There's, at least for me, there are no shortcuts. So it takes a lot of practice and kind of continuous practice. You know, you can't go out a couple days and then not do it for a month. You're going to kind of forget. So experimenting and practicing is really important. So let's say your photos aren't sharp. There are a lot of things you can do to look at that afterwards. Check your shutter speed. Was it fast enough? If you got a flying bird and you're at 1/500th of a second, there's a good chance it won't be sharp. Do you have proper image stabilization? Where is your focus point? A lot of your cameras have different review modes, and some of those review modes show you where your focus point was when you took each photo. So that can be very useful. If you have shallow depth of field, which is controlled by your f-stop, so in the like f4 to 7.1, so here in this hummingbird, the eye is sharp, but say the tail is out of focus, which is usually okay. That's because it doesn't have enough depth of field to keep the whole bird in focus. Here also the wings are out of focus, partly because of depth of field, and also because, as you know, the hummingbirds fly so fast that without flash, it can be very challenging to get sharp wings. And for me, that's okay, because I prefer not to use flash on birds. Another thing is heat distortion. If you've been like in Imperial Beach to try to photograph birds not on the beach, but on the behind, you know, you swear everything is sharp, but you have this heat distortion because the differential of temperature between the ground and the air. And except for getting closer, which often isn't possible, there really isn't anything you can do about that. But be aware of that happening. Learn from your mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The best thing to do is learn from them. I'll often look at my photos and try to figure out, okay, why didn't that work? What can I do differently next time? And that's how you improve. And don't be discouraged if you only have a few keepers from a session. That's pretty normal. And I always think, well, it only takes one really good photo of a bird, and then it doesn't matter whether all the others aren't as good. You just want to keep trying and improving. And sometimes having really bad photos kind of jolts you into, okay, I got to improve. What do I need to do? So I would say that practice is really the key to success here. So I'll mainly be talking about bird portraits today, but I just wanted to mention that you can also do environmental portraits, which tell the story of a bird in its environment. You often don't need as long of a lens. Probably a short zoom lens would work for this. And I think they also complement your bird portraits because they help to tell a different part of the story about the bird. So for a bird portrait, I'm just going to kind of go over what I think are some of the key aspects to one. As I've already mentioned, the eye really needs to be in focus. And I'll also mention a catch light is usually very important too. Then I think the head position is very important also. Is the bird looking away? Is the bird looking at you? What, maybe partly to the side? What kind of expression do you get from how the bird has positioned its head? Body posture, that can tell you a lot to this bird's story. And I'll just mention here, because this bird is basically in the same plane, by focusing on the eye, I was able to get really the whole bird in focus here. So all the feathers are very sharp, but that's just because it's all in the same focal plane. Usually feet aren't quite as important, but sometimes, like if you have a wader, to get one foot up out of the water can give you a little extra story. Or like in this photo, I thought having those feet there kind of adds a little bit, because often you're not paying quite as much attention to a sparrow's foot. And then I'll talk about background and lighting, how important those are. They can really make or break a photo. And then your viewpoint of, most of the time you want to try to be at eye level with the bird, because how you relate to the bird, which will be how your viewer relates to your photo, is also very important. So I don't think I need to go much about approaching birds. They're very aware, they see you, they read your body language. You really can't sneak up on a bird. I find approaching slowly, indirectly, sometimes pretending I'm doing something else helps. If the bird changes its behavior, you're probably getting too close. So be aware of that. And birds in public areas that are used to people are usually easier to approach. So that's especially important for photography, where you generally need to be a little closer than if you're just birding. So, but if you're like, this was at Santee Lakes, it's not great to get the pictures of them actually eating. Usually like when they're coming to eat or after they finished eating, often make the best photos. Finding food sources, not just people throwing birdseed at them. Finding their natural food. They'll often show repetitious behavior. Like you can imagine, this finch is probably just not going to eat one berry. So you're going to have time to get several rounds of photos. And birds tend to stay longer in areas where there's food. And you can often get a little closer because they're really interested in eating. But you don't want to disturb them so that they fly away and don't eat. The time of day can be very critical because it can determine the quality of light and the angle of the light to your subject. So early and late in the day are often the best times because the light the sun is low, so you have a low angle, so you have better illumination of the whole bird as opposed to midday coming down from on top. And that's usually very contrasty and glary, and you get shadows and highlights, and that can be very difficult light to work with. I also really like it when it's overcast, because everything is evenly lit, so you don't have to worry so much about those bright spots and dark shadows. But good photos can be made any time of the day. Sometimes you just have to really kind of look for a way to make a photo, during midday. And what's called golden hour light, it really does not last for an hour at our latitude, half an hour maybe. And this is shortly before sunset or shortly after sunrise, and it's beautiful light. It's got a nice warm cast to it. It's not harsh. So if you can photograph birds in that, that will help you have a very pleasing photo. I'll just kind of give a few examples of direction of light. On the left with the wood duck is side light. So the sun was to our left. So you can see how well lit the bird is on that side. The right was in shadow. I actually had to do some post-processing of bringing up the shadows, so it just didn't look very dark. So it can be dramatic, but sometimes you have to do some extra post-processing to help balance out your photo, especially if you have white and black in the bird. Front sunlight can be very appealing as long as it's not harsh midday. For the goose, it was early in the day, and actually a storm was just clearing. So it's kind of filtered sunlight, so the whole bird is evenly lit. So if you look at a lot of bird photography, they're either evenly lit in the front, or on the bottom right, the diffuse light is what you'll often see. Marine layer living on the coast is great, as long as it's not super thick, because all the bird is there's nice soft light, so you don't have all the harsh light. So it's much easier to get a good exposure. Catch light, that's a reflection in the eye. So here you can see right here, it really makes a huge difference, especially for a bird with a dark eye. If it's a really, let's say, a yellow eye or something, it's not so important. But for a dark eye, if it's just totally black, it just kind of goes dead. And it really depends on the angle of view to the bird and to your light source. And you can enhance it a little bit in post-processing. Some people will even make a fake catch light, but I really don't like doing that because outdoor catch lights are very complex. And these photos were taken just a couple seconds apart. And in here, there's the sun shining through, so you can see that extra catch light. And here, the sun was behind a tree. So just a few seconds can make a big difference, even in what kind of catch light or how the bird turns its head relative to you. So be looking for that, because if a bird is perched and kind of looking around, some angles you're not going to get much catch light, and I usually try not to take a photo there unless, of course, it's a rare bird or something, but wait for the bird to turn its head a little bit and see that catch light. Another critical thing is being at eye level, if at all possible. It places the viewer on an equal level with the bird, and I think helps to build a connection with the subject. It's a more intimate view. It can also really help to reduce background distractions, and we'll talk about that. Unfortunately, this means often the photographer has to get low to the ground. So sometimes that's not the most fun, but I have like a little plastic thing I can sit on or kneel on, which helps to get down. So you can see in this photo, looking down, it's just not really pleasing. The background's distracting, and you don't even have much of a catch light in this bird. But if you get low, you can usually get a much nicer background, and you just feel like you're a little bit closer to the bird. So think about that when you're out photographing, if there's a way to get more to eye level with the bird. So a big thing is background. I know when I first started photographing, I didn't pay much attention at all to background because you're so, all your focus is on the subject. Am I going to get the subject right? And you're not necessarily paying much attention to the background. But I think a background can make or break your photo. So you really want to try to eliminate the distractions. And with birds, it can be, sometimes it's impossible. You can't do it. But sometimes if the bird's cooperative, just moving a little bit or getting down a little bit more can really help with your background. So you want a background usually with even tones, and it helps to separate the subject from the background. Usually there's a distance. So the farther away your background is from the bird, the more softer and out of focus you can get it. Shallow depth of field, f4 to 6.3 can help with that as well. And also a little bit with post-processing. If you have a few areas that are really bright, you could maybe tone those down a little bit. So if you've been to Santee Lakes in the last couple of years, you probably recognize this duck. It's a very friendly duck. So with the photo, I like the pose. It's nice, soft light, but the background's terrible. But sometimes, I couldn't ask the duck to move elsewhere. So, but it made a good example for the background. There we go. Whereas this is a better background, I think I would actually darken this a little bit more. But it doesn't compete with the subject. You don't spend a lot of time looking at the background. Your main eye goes to the bird, and that's what you want. However, when you're doing reflections in water, you do need to look down on the bird a little bit. If you're totally level, you can't really see much of the surface of the water. So you need to be up a little bit. So there you're really trying to, figure out how much do you need to be up to get the type of reflection that you're looking for. And sometimes the reflection isn't just about the bird. Sometimes it's about the foliage in the sky and the different tones, especially in fall. You can get really nice tones, the nice warm tones from foliage that'll contrast with if you have blue sky. So you can get really interesting reflections, which can help really make your photo more interesting. It's not just about the bird, but also the bird in its colorful environment. So a big thing is you want to wait for action. And sometimes it happens quickly, and sometimes you wonder whether anything's ever going to happen. With this pied-billed grebe, I actually came upon the scene, so I actually didn't get as low as I wanted to, and that crawfish just didn't last very long. It was swallowed up pretty quickly after I saw this. But then wait around and see, is something else, is the bird going to keep fishing? Because birds often have repetition. So you can, if you're patient, you can wait for that. This is actually an example of looking up where I think it actually helps tell the story. I mean, we're so often having to look up at birds, and that's kind of what we get. But I think here with the way that foot is poised, and you can really see how the tail feathers are stacked, shorter, and they get longer. You could only see that from really underneath. So this is probably one of my rarer examples where looking up actually helps to tell the story. But here I have it, I took this picture. I like this one because what's going to happen, so there's some anticipation in the photo. Red-winged blackbirds, of course, in the spring when they're guarding their territory and displaying, that's often very repetitious behavior. So if you see where a red-winged blackbird is often perching, you can try to get a little closer, try to get a good angle, maybe see, okay, move just a little bit so you have a better background. Like here, I was able to get a totally out of focus background so it doesn't distract at all. And then I just waited for the bird to display. This egret was preening, and sometimes it seems like they're taking forever because they're going to do something near the end, because often they kind of ruffle their feathers or something, or with their wings or what have you, usually more near the end, it seems like. So I just kind of waited around until this guy finally kind of really fluffed out all of his feathers. Same with ducks. Usually when they're near the end, they kind of often they'll, dip a little bit, and then they'll really flap, a couple flaps. So you want to be ready for that. And when I talked about before about having your exposure ready, make sure you weren't going to overexpose or underexpose. This is really a good example where knowing your birds will help you get a good exposure. Because if you just base your exposure on what they look like when they're swimming around, you might think, okay, great, I've got a good exposure. But then when he comes up like this and you're faced with all this white, you may end up overexposing. So if you know that, you can think, okay, maybe I need to be just a little less exposure than I might think, so that I don't overexpose if the bird then comes and rears out of the water and flaps its wings. If you have more than a couple coots together, there's often action, whether it's one bird that kind of bullies the other or different birds. The action happens really fast, so you got to have everything dialed in, your shutter speed, your exposure. You don't want to overexpose the beak too much, but then the rest of the bird is black. And also with water too, when water is splashing, it's often very bright as well. So you may want to just slightly have everything slightly underexposed, because when you got water splashes, you don't want to totally blow those out of being just totally white. But just kind of pay attention to the birds and kind of see, are there two that you think might, start one chasing after the other, and be prepared. These snowy egrets were not getting along, so I had some opportunity to photograph them. And I'll also point out that this is two things about this. One, it's sidelight. And this photo, I think it works with it because you can really start to see the illumination through the wings. So that's kind of cool. The other thing is when you have more than one bird, sometimes if you have enough light, you might want to try to increase your depth of field. So that would be taking your f-stop to a bigger number, like f8. If you have tons of light, you might be able to get a little higher than that, but I don't know if I ever really get to like f11. But that might help you be able to get both birds in focus, because you can only focus on one, and they're not always exactly in the same plane. So there, if you have enough light and without sacrificing shutter speed, you might want to increase your ISO a little bit and get a little more depth of field to get both of your birds in focus. So I thought I'd say a little bit about warblers and other small, fast birds that forage in foliage. As probably anyone who's tried to photograph them knows, they're very tricky to photograph. It'll be interesting when warbler season comes upon us and I can see how my eye focus works in, teepoo trees. But generally the camera I've had for the last 10 plus years, didn't have a lot of fancy focusing. So I really just use single point focus. So I got pretty good at that. And it actually, I think, is probably going to be one of the best ways, even with more advanced focusing techniques, of photographing birds in all the foliage. So your focusing really works by, it's really looking for contrast in lines, horizontal, vertical lines, and contrast between dark and light. So this warbler is actually a really good one to try to focus on, because this line here of black and white right above the eye, the focus points love that. They can really grasp onto it, and since it's by the eye, if it grasps onto that area there, you're probably going to get good eye focus. But a bird that, say, might be gray, really not have any much in the way of facial marks, your camera might end up seeing this beautiful tipu leaf and little twig behind, and decide, because it's that beautiful contrast, there are these sharp edges, and might decide that that's really what you want to focus on. Because sometimes I'm sure I have my focus right on the eye, and it's focusing on a little twiggy, either in front or behind. So if you have a lot of branches and the bird's stationary, maybe try, if you have time, move your focus point around just a little bit. So probably at least one of those will get you something sharp. But it can be frustrating, but you have to understand that it sees contrast and sometimes color too. And some focusing modes are more dependent on color contrast than others. So it's really a lot of experimenting. You really need fast shutter speed. These birds are moving fast, plus they might do something interesting. Even if they're perched, they then might suddenly fly or do something with their wings. So you want to be ready for that. And you also want to anticipate, where do you think the bird's going to go? If it's on a tree, kind of where's your light? Can you get the light behind you as opposed to trying to photograph into the sun? So you might be wrong some of the times in where you think the bird's going to go, but if you're right and you've figured out it might go to this clearer patch with fewer leaves, then you're going to get a better photo. So once again, your birding skills really come into play here in anticipating what you think the bird's going to do. And occasionally they do sit still for a few moments. And then once again, you want to be ready, you have your settings ready so that you can get those photos. You're not messing around with trying to get everything right with your camera. So just, be ready. Years ago, I took a workshop from a wildlife photographer, and that was one of his main messages, is you got to be ready. And he was so right. Another thing you want to do is try to tell a story, either with one photo, which could be very challenging, or a series of photos. And just, you can look at some of the, major photographers or photojournalists, and just kind of look at how they tell a story in one or more photos. So I just thought I'd just give one example of that. And I really like lease turns and watching the colonies. And usually when a parent comes in with a fish, it's calling before it gets in. So the chicks are running around, they're all ready. And the fish usually gets transferred within a second or so to the chick. And the parent just stays around long enough for the chick to gobble down the fish, and then the parent's gone. But as you can see in this photo, that wasn't what was happening. And at the time, when I was there, I didn't know why. Because, it's like, well, it's chicks, or what's going on here? And you can see the adult looks a little perplexed too. And then after a little bit, a larger chick wandered in, and obviously that chick belonged to this adult, and the adult fed the fish to the chick. And before the chick was still just barely getting it down, and the parent took off. And normally I thought, okay, the parent's going off to get another fish. That's what normally happens. But this bird had a quick little stop before he was going fishing again. He actually went back is only a little ways away, and it was like he was punishing one of those other chicks that I showed in the first photo of the series, for wanting the fish. So I've this is the only time I've ever seen this. But that poor little chick, and then the chick then gets off and runs off, and the parent was kind of, the adult was kind of going after it a bit before it finally flew off. But this is not usually what happens with these terns, so I thought it made a nice little story. Post-processing, I'm really not going to say too much about that because that's like a whole whole session in itself. I shoot in RAW, never JPEG. You have so much more data that you can get from RAW files than JPEG. So if you're willing to spend a little extra time processing them, it's worth it. I use Adobe Camera Raw to do the initial adjustments, and then I take them into Photoshop. And I really strive to make my photos look realistic and true to the bird. And depending on the photo, I may have to do more or less to do that. I usually adjust color balance, contrast, the vibrance. Sometimes I need to burn and dodge, which means either lighten some areas like shadows or make them a little darker. Say if it's almost burnt out, I can make that white just a little less white so I can get a little more feather detail in that. And it really depends on the lighting and on the photo. And as I already talked about, topaz denoise it actually changed the way I photograph birds because being able to have higher ISOs so I can really stop the action and really get sharp photos. But when I have really high ISOs for my camera, sometimes it'll try to turn that noise into detail. And often it's just a few little sections of the photo. So sometimes I have to deal with that. And but probably 90% of the time I don't have to, but occasionally I do. So I thought I'd talk about a few favorite places I like to photograph because the best places to bird are not necessarily the best places to take really good photos. So I thought I'd just mention that. I really like this quote by Sir David Attenborough. I've been privileged to have witnessed some truly breathtaking wildlife spectacles in far-flung locations, but some of my most memorable experiences have happened when I've been simply sitting and watching the wildlife that lives where I do. I mean, we're in a great county for birds, so we really need to appreciate all the fantastic birds that we have here. I mean, people fly from all over to photograph our birds. So my backyard, I mean, and this is for anyone, if you have a yard or even a nearby park, food and habitat will attract birds. It's a great place to photograph young birds. These are young mourning doves. Every year the song sparrows bring their fledglings. As soon as they fledge, they bring them to my yard. For a couple of days, they're really shy, so I don't try to photograph them then. Then for a couple of days, the young ones are out in the open and the parents are feeding them. So that's when I photograph them. And then after that, the parents kind of taper off feeding them. So it's a really narrow window of only a couple of days when I can try to photograph them. But because the parents know me, they're really not bothered by me being there. Whereas if I go, into a park or something and I see fledglings, the parents usually, they hide their fledglings. So it's really good to try to get those types of photos. Anna's hummingbirds love the fuzz from this weed. And who knew that it opens up in mid-morning and then the wind disperses them. So it's actually a fairly narrow time of day when this happens. But during breeding season, all the Annas the females just love coming and gathering this fluff for their nests. When we put up a solar fountain, the hummingbirds were thrilled. Now they're kind of like, oh, ho hum, because they have a fountain every day. But that made for some fun photos. And when it rains, you can get some good photos when it rains if you know how to photograph. I have a large umbrella. I occasionally do that. But I like photographing the hummingbirds actually from my kitchen window. I use my monopod. It's actually, I have it in the kitchen sink. I open up the window And this guy, he rules the feeders by the patio, and they love taking baths or showers when it rains. So it's a really good time. It's very repetitious behavior once again. Santee Lakes, year-round, the birds are approachable, especially any of the birds that are around water, either the ducks, the herons, what have you. Really good place. They're used to people. So I'm not going to talk anymore, not going to show any more photos, because many of the photos from the presentation were actually from Santee Lakes. But I really like Santee Lakes for photography and birding too. The coastline, summer can be challenging because of the crowds, and there's kind of a time when there aren't too many birds there. But fall through spring, there usually aren't too many people at the beach, or like in La Jolla. So I really enjoy going to the coastline. Near sunset, or if you have the right orientation, would be after sunrise. You get really wild colors in the sand reflecting, so you can get these really interesting backgrounds for the birds. Tide pools, you have to really look at the tide. Some beaches, certainly in Encinitas where I live, some beaches are obliterated at high tide, so you really have to go at lower tides. And when the tides get even lower, there are tide pools, and then occasionally egrets and other birds will come in and kind of go through the tide pool. So you never know what you're going to get. This was spring. These birds were migrating, and I just sat on the beach and photographed them, because there was a lot of behavior. There was courtship, and I just love their spiky hairdo. Feeding, it's a great time to photograph birds. And the beach is a great place to practice flight photos. You've got gulls in the winter, you've got terns in the summer, you've got pelicans. A lot of these birds just go back up and down the beach, so you can really practice. Years ago, someone told me that was a good place to practice, and she was absolutely right. So if you're struggling with flight photography, try going to a beach when there are a lot of flying birds, and you can usually get a lot of practice in that way. La Jolla, the cliffs there, especially in the wintertime, really good places to photograph pelicans. Arthur Morris, he always has his group there in January. Actually, this year I stood right next to him and his assistant shortly before I took this photo. So a lot of people come there to photograph. Both Del Mar and La Jolla have the peregrine falcons in spring. So if you're into that, that's really good. That's very popular with people. Sanderlings, if they're feeding, they're just going back and forth with the waves. So there's always action when they're here. So I always like photographing them. And this marbled godwit had just flown in. So usually they're just kind of walking around. So trying to get one with its wings up was kind of fun. And lastly, Anza Borrego. I find it harder to find birds there, and sometimes they're kind of shy. But because the desert's a little sparser, the backgrounds are usually pretty good. You usually don't have a lot of busy stuff in the background. So that's one big advantage for photographing there. This one I took actually from my car, so I didn't scare the bird. I like getting birds when they're singing. So this is the only example I have of backlight, which can work under the right circumstances, but as you can see, the eye really doesn't, it has just a tiny catch light. It's hard to get a catch light with backlighting. If the bird's like fluffing or has fluffy feathers or doing something with its feathers and all, backlighting can really be spectacular. And I like it here also because of what it does with the cactus spines. It really lights those up. So it's not lighting that I go for a lot, but sometimes it really works. This is my one example of harsh midday light, kind of a little bit behind the Roadrunner, but I couldn't exactly ask the Roadrunner to move to better light. So you just, you got to take what you get. And I had the color balance, was very tricky, but I like the pose. So you just kind of work with it, and photos like this take longer in post-processing than photos that say are in soft light. Just some nice poses. I always like those. And trying to show a little personality of the sagebrush sparrow. And then finally, just what I call beyond eBird, trying to be a little more artistic than what you're doing for eBird. Panning. So this would be slow shutter speed, like 1/15 to 1/30. So this, say you've got nice light, but it's after sunset. The key is you start panning on the bird, click, and then keep panning even after the shutter is exposed. So you have that, good follow through, good motion. And here I like the way that the bird blends in with the ocean, kind of showing their interrelatedness. In Photoshop, they've got like watercolor filters and other artistic ones. So I like playing around with those. And sometimes if your photo is a little bit blurry, it actually works great for a filter, even though you may not want to use it for other things, but sometimes it can work for more artistic things. Munio is kind of in a funny pose. And then if you're into Photoshop, you know about layers. This is just a couple layers of texture along with the bird photo, and then just using different blend modes. So it's actually very easy once you know how to do your layers. And you never know what you're going to get. So it's just kind of fun to play with. For this one, I wanted to have a background that matched all the blues and purples of the bird, just to kind of emphasize that. Otherwise, it was just this very dull gray background behind it. So I thought, well, it was just kind of fun to jazz it up a little bit. And then more advanced Photoshop techniques where you're actually masking out the birds, and then putting in these textures, kind of painted backgrounds, because this had a very boring background. It was like bricks. And then you can be artistic with how you're doing that. Same with this warbler. Great light. I like the pose, but behind it was all these Palo Verde branches and light and shadow. So very busy background. There wasn't anything I could do about the background, but I like to make some artistic things with a few of my bird photos too. And that wraps it up. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take any questions. So I stopped sharing. And also I'll just put in a very quick plug that the third Saturday of every month, I lead a bird walk for the Buena Vista Audubon Society. You can find the locations and info on the newsletter. So if you have photo questions, you can come along to one of my bird walks. I'm always happy to talk about birds and photos and everything else.
Well, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
There had been a question about what was noise. Early on, you were discussing noise.
So noise. So if you remember the good old days of film, that would have been grain. So faster film had more grain. So it's instead of having like a smooth background, you have all these little. It almost looks like sand, I guess might be a good way to describe it. And the equivalent of your film, I think it was like ASA, is now ISO. And it has to do with sensitivity. So if you have a higher ISO, it makes your sensor more sensitive to light. So if you're in a dark situation, you can still get a good photo. But there's always a cost to that. And that's in noise, or in the noise, or what would have been grain back in the film days. So the quality is not as good. But that's what, like the topaz denoise is really good at bringing back the sharpness and getting rid of a lot of the noise while keeping detail. So the noisy things, it starts to take over the photo and it kind of obscures some of the detail.
Martha Wild was asking, she said that she presumes the noise software is post-processing.
Yes, yes. And you don't even need to use things like Photoshop. You can actually just drag your photo into like Topaz Denoise and just do it there. You don't need any other software processing program.
So
And I don't get any money from the manufacturer.
Kay Bosco asks, how do you catalog your pictures?
No, I try to put the best ones in eBird, which kind of works as a catalog there. There are different ways I have of filing, and actually I try to make a folder of my best bird photos for every year, because that's probably what you're most interested in. So as I'm going through them, if I remember, if I have a couple really good ones from a shoot, I'll make a copy of that and put that in another folder. Or if you use Lightroom, you can then put it in a collection. But it's after a while, it gets, I don't put names on every single photo because that would just take way too long.
If I will jump in and say I use Lightroom and I keyword all of my photos. So that's one of the features that you can do. And as I was explaining to somebody recently, if someone asked me for fledgling photos for something, I can type in fledgling and all of the photos of fledglings will show up together. So it's, you know, it's not a lot of work, little extra work, and do the keywording.
Yeah, I think the thing is to focus on just do it on your best photos, not on every photo.
So Chris McMillan is asking, can you describe how you interpret the rule of thirds? I love how you crop them.
So the rule of thirds is if you divide everything, so I'm just trying to think if I have like two pencils here. If you look at my screen, so I have one here, and it's really hard to do this. So one here, and then put the other one here. So you've divided it here into thirds. And then if you do it this way, you've divided it also into thirds. And if you can imagine where those intersecting points are, and I just have one of them here, there are 4 of them. So here it's on the lower quadrant. Those are compositionally are kind of powerful points. So it's a good place to put like the eye or the face, even though a lot of mine often end up kind of a little more in the center. But if you can, for cropping, that's often a more powerful place to put them. But you also have to keep in mind that, say if you have a bird that's looking to the right, you also want to leave some space on the right. So space for the bird to look into. So you might put the bird in the 1/3, and then it has 2/3 of the photo to look into.
Yeah, as more and more people are doing photography, more and more of these issues are coming up. You know, people are not only trying to learn how to bird, they're trying to learn how to document their birds or enjoy the birds in a visual way. So
Yes.
you know, there's a lot to do here.
Yes.
Any other questions?
No, I just want to say though, I typically gravitate towards the natural representations of birds. However, I was really struck by the use of backgrounds. Your Wilson's warbler was striking. I just thought that was beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah,
Really
occasionally
nice.
you get such a good bird, but the background is
Mhm.
you know, so that's where we're trying to do artistic things. And I got to say, that's kind of a silver lining for me from the pandemic, is that I really learned Photoshop and a lot of techniques, which I otherwise might not have. So sometimes it's fun to kind of take your photos a step farther.
Well, I'm inspired.
Yeah, let's go take pictures.
Absolutely.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Barbara.
You're very welcome.
Indeed. Thanks again, Barbara. We all appreciate it. And for those of you who will be with us next month, we will have James Babbitt here to present birding in Cuba.
Ooh, very good. All right, if you want to stop the recording.
Oh, I also saw that there's a question in the chat about what I'm using. So for many years, I've had a Nikon D800, which is like a 12-year-old model, but it still takes fantastic photos. I just got the newest Nikon Z8 mirrorless, and it's a learning curve. I've never bought an ebook before on how to use a camera, but I bought one and it's like 450 pages. So, and it's really and it's just for wildlife photography. That's all it's focusing on, because there's so much to try to learn. So I'm sure everyone else that's gone mirrorless also is gone through the learning curve.
Yeah, there's several of us who use either the Z8 or the Z9, and like you said, it is mind-blowing just trying to figure this out. You know, it's
Well, I highly, it was Steve Perry. I highly recommend
yes.
his.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, he's got a good YouTube and then the book. So.
All righty, I'm gonna stop the recording now.